Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfix. This will be the continuation and last and final part to State of Mind. This will be Chapter 28, entitled Welcome to the Edge. The sun had risen some time ago over the hill, and the early November day was warm and bright, perfect for a wedding. The two of them stood in the bathroom at UA while Shoto adjusted Izuku's tie, despite the other boys fidgeting. "They make no sense to me," Izuku was explaining, his brow furrowed, his eyes on the mirror to the side as he carefully watched Shoto tie it. "I just don't understand how you go from that." He gestured to Shoto's untied tie on the table next to them. "To this." He pointed to the one on his neck, nearly done. "It's quite simple," Shoto responded flatly, giving it a small tug to make sure it was tight enough. Izuku frowned when Shoto didn't elaborate, turning to see his completed look in the mirror. At his side, Shoto grabbed his own tie, twining it around his neck and pulling it underneath his collar. Both of the ties were light blue with golden flecks in them and silky to the touch. For some unknown reason, Izuku thought it would make a better headband than a tie with how soft it was. He touched the tie with the middle finger on his right hand, brow furrowed as he looked at his fancy appearance in the mirror. Why were ties so soft anyway? Wouldn't they complete their main purpose if they were made of canvas or something else instead? Could Izuku make ties with his mindscape? Could Momo make ties? That would be pretty cool, actually. Now that he thought about it, he should get tips from the second-class rep about her quirk. He bet she could help him with his problem of literally not being able to create anything, unless it was a dire situation. "You look amazing," Shoto suddenly said, noticing what he was doing, and Izuku met his eyes in the mirror, heat pooling in his cheeks. "I don't," he responded bashfully, pulling at his collar. In the mirror, he could see the scar on his neck, peeking out above it. It looked awkward and gross. He should have covered it with makeup. He'd been tempted to cover the scars on his face as well, but then Shoto had looked at him with those never-ending, multicolored eyes and asked Izuku if he felt like Shoto needed to cover the scar on his own face, too. Izuku had pretty quickly decided not to cover any of his scars after that. "You do," Shoto repeated, leaving no room for argument, and turned to face him, smoothing a thumb across the horizontal scar that spread over his forehead, above his eyes, then sliding it down to the bridge of his nose to lightly touch the two scars that formed a crooked X below his left eye. "I'll tell you that as many times as it takes until you believe me." Izuku's blush deepened, and he looked away. "You look great too, you know." Shoto scoffed, finishing his tie easily. Izuku only smiled and checked that the neon yellow pins in his hair were tight enough that any wind wouldn't disrupt the shorter hair on the right side of his head. They seemed fine, albeit a little strange looking with the rest of his ensemble. But he needed something colorful. Suits were so dreary. Izuku ran a finger beneath his collar with a grimace. It was annoying and kind of itchy. "Why do people wear suits?" he sighed. "This sucks. It's so uncomfortable." "Have you never worn a suit before?" Shoto raised a brow at him incredulously in the mirror. "I've never had a reason to." Izuku shook his head, frowning. "Only my uniforms for school and stuff." Shoto hummed to himself. "I've had to wear them for a lot of hero galas and things. I got used to them, I suppose. They're not so bad." Izuku shrugged, dropping his hands away from his collar and imagining how much better he would feel in galaxy print leggings and his skeleton astronaut shirt. "Ready to go?" Shoto finally asked, fixing the part in his hair with a comb, making sure the white and red were divided evenly in the middle. "Mm-hmm," Izuku answered with a sigh. He didn't really know anything about weddings or how they were supposed to go, or what he was supposed to do. His mother had told him that her and Ito's wedding was more unconventional than most Japanese weddings, partly because of their age and partly because Inko had already been married once before. They didn't want or need anything grand, just being together was good enough for them. It was kind of sweet, when Izuku thought about it. Side by side, Izuku and Shoto headed out of the bathroom and toward where Aizawa, Mike, and Eri were waiting on them in the common room. Eri jumped up from the couch when they walked in and ran over to Izuku, who crouched, watching as she demonstrated her clothes. "You look so nice, Eri." He smiled and she stepped back, doing a little twirl, the skirt of her dress flaring outward. "Mike showed me how to do this." She came to a stop, eyes bright. She wore a light blue dress that came to her knees with white leggings beneath them. Her white hair was French braided and laced through with brightly colored ribbons. There was a little bit of black right at the roots of her hair, and Izuku wondered if she'd noticed it yet. "He did?" Izuku asked, glancing up at Mike, who stood and twirled in answer, wearing the same suit as Izuku and Shoto, but lifting his hands out as if he were wearing a dress. From where he was standing, leaning against the couch, Aizawa rolled his eyes. "Let's go. We're going to be late." The drive to the venue was relaxing. Eri leaned partly out of the window, giggling at the feeling of the wind across her face. Izuku sat in the middle, between Shoto and his sister, and he leaned back, hand brushing against Shoto's, humming to whatever song Mike had playing on the radio. Shoto was a comforting, concrete presence at his side, and Izuku was immensely grateful that he was there with him. That he had him. They pulled in near the wedding hall, unsurprised at the small amount of vehicles already there. His mom had said she wanted a small Western-style wedding for the most part. She'd had a Shinto wedding for Hisashi and hated every bit of it. She told Izuku that she was happy to just have family nearby, just for the people she knew cared about her and no one else. They piled out of the car and Shoto tapped Izuku's elbow. "Leave it alone, Izuku," he whispered, and Izuku belatedly noticed that he was tugging at his collar. "Ugh, I hate it." He sighed but dropped his hand. "I can't wait to change into regular clothes." Shoto shook his head, but his gaze on Izuku was fond, as he patted his arm in an attempt to be reassuring. Their small group walked towards the wedding hall, Mike and Aizawa swinging Eri between their bodies, her small hands in theirs. From where he walked behind them, Izuku was smiling. He'd seen them all in civilian clothes enough by now that you'd think it wouldn't be strange, but this was his first time seeing them in suits, and they both looked so different than what Izuku was used to. Mike's yellow hair was down, trailing down his back in layers. Aizawa's black hair was up, in a neat bun, and there was no capture weapon or directional speaker in sight. It was kind of nice. It felt so domestic somehow. It felt real. As they walked inside and found a place to sit, Izuku considered not just how far he'd come, but how far his mom had come too. He hadn't forgiven her for everything. Of course he hadn't. And he didn't think he ever would. And that was okay. But he had to admit she was trying, which meant something. Everyone deals with trauma differently. Her way had been running from it, even if it meant leaving him. And maybe he should hate her for it. But he had come too far for that now. He felt so far removed from that part of his life now. He felt happy. He didn't want to be angry anymore. Izuku wanted what was best for his mom, and he was glad she'd found someone to share the rest of her life with. He was truly happy for her. The five of them settled down on a row of chairs lining the hall, and Izuku looked around. He didn't really recognize anyone, and assumed the rest of the people there were probably Ito and his mom's colleagues and friends. He could never remember meeting his mother's parents or any other family at all, now that he thought about it. He knew very little about his mother. Shoto sat down on Izuku's left side and Aizawa to his right, then Eri and Mike, their group taking up the entire bench. Izuku was glad. He didn't really want to have to sit near people he didn't know. The actual wedding didn't start for some time, and Izuku grew restless, constantly moving in his seat, shaking his legs and tapping his foot against the ground, peering around at everyone. Eri didn't seem to be faring much better, and Aizawa eventually grew tired of it, standing up and grabbing Eri beneath her arms and switching places with her. "Problem children. Entertain each other," he grumbled and dropped into the other seat, next to Mike, who laughed at his husband. Izuku pulled his legs onto the seat, crossing them and facing Eri as he pulled a puzzle from his mindscape and showed Eri how to complete it, matching colors together. He showed her how fast he could do it and then scrambled it back up and handed it to her, watching with mirth as she struggled to do what he had done. He'd taught himself how to complete it with the help of the internet at the local library when he lived alone for so long. There had only been so much to do, and it wasn't like he'd had any friends to do anything with. But he was glad that something he'd learned could help his sister be happy. Eri was now occupied, and Izuku turned back to Shoto with a sigh. "Izuku," Shoto sighed, displeased, reaching out and grabbing Izuku's right hand where it had been unconsciously tugging at his collar. "You don't have to wear it for much longer." Izuku groaned lightly, leaning back in his chair and grumbling to himself. Shoto didn't release his hand, smoothing a finger across the short stump of Izuku's missing index finger. Shoto knew that sometimes the phantom pain bothered him, and he'd taken to running his fingers over it in an attempt to be soothing. Izuku always seemed to like it anyway. "I never want to wear a suit again," he whined. Aizawa leaned in to whisper over Eri's head. "You and me both, kid." It wasn't much longer after that when the music started up and both Inko and Ito walked in together, arm in arm, in their own way. They were definitely doing their own version of a wedding. Not a lot was traditional about this. Though they had decided to keep a few of both Western and Shinto ideals, mixing them together. Izuku's mother wore a white kimono, and Ito wore a suit similar to most of the guys there, except his tie was almost completely golden. Everyone sat down once the couple took their place on the dais at the front, and Aizawa had to tell Izuku to unfold his legs and sit like a normal person, to which he sighed, but did as asked. Izuku watched attentively as the two up front exchanged small cups of sake, elbows crossing, both of them smiling into their drinks before dropping their hands and meeting for a kiss. Their auras were glowing with happiness. After the ceremony, the banquet began, and Izuku went up to see his mom, now changed into a light blue party dress. She looked happy, bright red spots high on her cheeks and eyes alight. He'd never seen her aura so untroubled and gleeful. "Izuku!" she exclaimed with a grin when he approached her with Shoto at his side. Aizawa and Mike were at the food tables, bickering about what foods to have Eri try for the first time. "I'm so glad you all could make it." Izuku nodded, glancing sideways at Shoto. He was bad at this public stuff, especially around his mom. Shoto seemed to understand, picking up the slack and bowing his head. "We're glad we could make it as well. The ceremony was very nice." Izuku's own voice resonated deep inside, and a memory came forward, to the front of his mind, uncalled for. "May I be excused?" "Please stay," Inko said to him, voice bittersweet and hurt. "It's your birthday." Izuku flinched at her words. "So what? It's just another day, it doesn't matter. You don't need to force yourself to be around me." Inko gasped at his harsh words. Izuku wasn't angry, though. He was just resigned, as if he had known this truth for a long time. "I'm not," His mom started before Izuku interrupted. "Don't lie to me." Izuku grit his teeth, pushing the memory aside and reaching down to grasp Shoto's hand. Maybe the past wasn't as far away as he would like, but he was strong, and regardless of how far his history was, he'd come a long way since his 10th birthday. There was no denying that. That history would run out eventually to make way for new and better memories. "Yeah, it was great," Izuku said, forcing his tone to be even. Honestly, this was all a bit much for him, even though there weren't that many people. His skin itched, and he couldn't get over the feeling that he was being watched. He knew he was imagining it, but it was still annoying. After a few more pleasantries were exchanged with the Itos, Shoto and Izuku headed back over to the food tables. Izuku just grabbed whatever food he saw first, gathering it onto a plate and then allowing Shoto to guide him to their seats. He dropped into his seat with a heavy sigh and looked up at the ceiling. "You good, little listener?" Mike asked, with a concerned gaze, leaning forward to look at Izuku. "I'm fine," Izuku answered, glancing back down at his plate full of what looked like watermelon and chunks of cheese. How eclectic. A hand rubbing circles on his back had Izuku looking up at his partner. "You don't do too well in crowds, do you?" Mismatched eyes stared deeply into his own. Izuku swallowed, eyes flicking around them at the non-stop movements at the edges of his vision. "I guess not," he sighed, forcing his eyes back on Shoto's and shrugging. "It's the fact that I don't know a lot of people here, and I don't really know, actually." "It's all right," Shoto reassured. "Are you ready to go? We've stayed for what we needed to. I think it's okay if we leave now." Izuku glanced to his other side to find Aizawa nodding at them. He looked up to see his mom and Ito completely distracted with each other's company, surrounded by their friends. They surely wouldn't mind him leaving early. He could probably call his mom later to talk about it, if she wanted. Izuku let out a breath of relief. "Okay." So they left the wedding early and ended up walking to a nearby ice cream shop together. They made quite the appearance at the tiny place, 4 guys decked out in fancy black suits and a little white-haired girl riding on Mike's shoulders and laughing happily. The ice cream attendant smiled at Eri, as if her happiness was contagious, and then gave her a free ice cream, anything she wanted. She ended up wanting to get whatever her big brother got, though, so Izuku picked out the sweetest flavor he could find, which ended up being cookie dough. They went outside to eat it, sitting at the tables out there. Izuku had to lean forward to keep it from dripping onto his suit and watched with amusement as Eri didn't bother trying to not get it on her dress or literally everywhere else. She sat next to Aizawa and kept grabbing his arm to get his attention to show him something random, but in doing so, smearing the ice cream from her messy hands all over his suit. The hero didn't seem to mind all that much, letting Eri show him whatever she wanted. She was experiencing a lot of new things for the first time, after all. It was cool out, not really the time or weather for ice cream, but none of them cared. The point was that they were all together, and Izuku would argue that ice cream was good at any time of the year anyway. Izuku felt a lot more relaxed here and looked up at the tall buildings and the swooping birds, the sunlight glinting off of office windows and the paned glass of shops nearby. People around them went about their day, completely ignoring their existence, unaware of their lives. Izuku could hear Eri talking in the background and Mike laughing about something. Cars drove by, engines rumbling loudly. The air smelled of exhaust and ice cream and his own fruity shampoo. "Izuku." Shoto nudged his shoulder, and Izuku looked to the side. "Hmm?" "You're dripping." The boy nodded to Izuku's hand, and he glanced down, cursing when he saw the ice cream cone dripping onto his glove. These were brand new gloves, too, since he'd lost his at the fight with Akuma. Aizawa handed him a pile of napkins, and Izuku wiped the mess up, then hastily finished his ice cream, wishing he'd gotten a cup instead. That night, Izuku collapsed in his nook after changing into much more comfortable clothes, and Shoto sat down at his desk, leaning back. Izuku was exhausted and cuddled with Wink when she crawled onto his chest, purring happily, glad that he was home. He was glad too, and cuddled her tightly, her purr reverberating in his chest. "If we ever get married, let's do something really private, with only the people that we love." Izuku sighed, looking up at the ceiling as he pet Wink. He missed the intense blush that erupted on Shoto's cheeks, and the flames that flickered across his skin. Their first year ended with fanfare and excitement, and their second ended much the same. Toward the end of their third year, the class organized something for Izuku, a late birthday present apparently. The entirety of Class 3A sat in the common room of the dorms, all piled on the couches or the floors as Izuku looked around, confused as to what was going on. Mina was focused as she messed with a projector in the middle of the room before screaming at everyone to be quiet as a gentle song started playing. "What's going on?" Izuku whispered to Shoto, as Wink jumped onto his lap, Mina shutting off the lights as the projector lit up the entire wall. "Just watch," Shoto answered, meeting Aizawa's eyes as some of the teachers filed in, all standing against the opposite walls. Aizawa blinked at him once before looking toward the wall where the first picture was getting ready to show. Izuku gasped, eyes widening, when it started. The first picture showed a much smaller, baby-faced Izuku sitting on a pile of what looked like trash, with a coffee mug in his right hand, his hair down, even on both sides, cascading down his shoulders. The sun shined over a glistening ocean in the distance, indicating early morning, and the young boy's gaze was turned toward it, tired, jade eyes taking it all in under the opalescent sky. Something in that boy's eyes showed the urge to persevere, showed strength, showed determination. Submitted by Yagi Toshinori. At this point, everyone knew that Izuku was taking up All Might's mantle and that they'd trained together before classes began, but they were almost surprised to see all of Izuku's fingers there. Having known him for much longer with the finger missing on his hand than with it intact, it was a reminder of how quickly things had changed for the now Class 3A after their first year had started. How quickly things had gone wrong. Izuku glanced back at the teachers and All Might smiled crookedly at his successor, tossing a thumbs up. Izuku smiled back and returned his attention to the wall. This picture was obviously a mistaken selfie from the hospital. It was shaky, as if Izuku's hands had been trembling. His face and chest took up the entire frame. There were deep bruises beneath his dulled green eyes. His face was pale, his freckles in sharp contrast to the pallid skin tone. His hair was newly shaved on one part of his head, showing the surgery mark, held together with staples. A cannula in his nose increased the image of his touch with death. There was panic and fear in his eyes, a direct contradiction to the way his eyes had appeared in the last picture. Submitted by Aizawa Shota. Izuku winced, his hand lifting to touch against the scar, snaking beneath his hair on the right side of his head. There were many gasps from the class, almost all of them except for Mina, who'd put the slideshow together and had seen the picture when Aizawa had given it to her. Izuku glanced back at Aizawa, and his guardian gave him a look. Izuku somehow managed to know what it meant, why Aizawa had submitted that picture for the slideshow. He was showing Izuku how far he had come since that first week of classes, when he would so easily let himself be hurt. So many things had changed since then. He was so much better, so much stronger. Aizawa was letting him know, in his own way, how far they had both come. Aizawa leaned against the back of a bed in a dark hospital room, Izuku practically cradled in his arms as he slept. His brow creased even while resting. The side of Izuku's head was bandaged, as well as his hand, showing that the picture had been taken shortly after the USJ attack, during their first year, and probably directly after the last picture. Aizawa was looking down at the boy, his own face hidden behind a layer of bandages. But Class 3A knew the concern that most certainly lay behind them. Submitted by Yamada Hisashi. Shoto glanced at Izuku, finding him blushing deeply at being viewed held by their teacher like that, despite them all having seen it in person before. Wink was held to his chest as he watched the pictures. Shoto smiled and patted Izuku's gloved hand, looking back up. The next picture showed Aizawa walking up an unfamiliar sidewalk, carrying a sleeping Izuku against his chest, his head tucked under Aizawa's chin, against his collarbone. There were bandages around his head and hand, the absence of his right index finger obvious where his hand lay across the middle of his waist, wrapped. Submitted by Yamada Hisashi. Izuku leaned back in surprise, confused. He had no idea about all these pictures so far. They were from so long ago, so much time had passed since then. But it was hard to believe how much of it still felt like it had just happened. It was strange to see the way he'd looked after the USJ attack. Strange to see how dead he appeared. He remembered all of the fights and experiences with Shigaraki or Handyman since then, and shuddered. That guy had always had it out for him, even before he knew he had one for all, before everything that had happened afterward. Izuku sighed, pushing the memories from his mind. Now was not the time to be remembering the bad things. Izuku lay on a couch, pulled into a small, pitiful-looking ball, face buried in his knees and arms wrapped around them. One could see the fresh, reddened scar, cutting through newly cut hair on the side of his head. Aizawa lay beside him, one leg crossed next to the boy, and the other hanging off the side of the couch. Aizawa's head lay on the armrest, his long black hair brushing against the ground. Submitted by Yamada Hisashi. "When will I come in?" Eri asked fervently from Izuku's left side, watching the pictures with bright eyes. She'd skipped elementary school to stay at UA and watch all the pictures with her family. Mina must have told everyone but Izuku ahead of time, so that they could all prepare and submit these pictures. "I'm sure you'll be in soon." Izuku smiled, lifting a hand from Wink to pat Eri's short black hair. When it had started growing in black, she'd wanted the white all cut out of it. And now she had black, blue-tinged hair, short and spiky around her head. She absolutely loved it, and it made her look extra spunky, especially with the neon yellow cat ear headband she always wore. There was another one of Izuku on the same couch, but this one was different. No longer in a ball, Izuku lay stretched out, legs over Aizawa's. One hand had fallen off the side of the couch, knuckles resting against the floor. Wink was sprawled over his head, tail wrapped around his neck. Both Aizawa and Izuku were soundly asleep. Submitted by Yamada Hisashi. Smiling, Izuku turned his head to see Mike. Catching his look, his guardian beamed at him. He'd really taken a lot of pictures. Izuku was kind of glad. Shoto tapped his arm, and Izuku looked back at the slideshow as the picture changed. Within the familiarity of the dorm common room, Izuku stood, tears in his eyes as he held Wink to his chest. Next to him, Kirishima was grinning, sharp teeth showing as he gestured to Wink, wearing her clean, new hero costume. Shoto could be seen in the background, watching them with the barest hint of a smile on his face. Submitted by Ashido Mina. Mina cheered at a picture of her own finally being shown, and Izuku nudged Shoto with his elbow, smiling. "Were you always watching me like that?" Shoto hid his smile, lifting a cup of tea to his lips and sipping at it. Izuku chuckled and looked back up. Izuku sat on a bus, his new provisional license held next to his face, a smile tugging at his lips. eyes exhausted but bright. The hair on the right side was just slightly longer than before, the scar barely visible, and pulled back into a braid. He looked tired, but happy. Submitted by Todoroki Shoto. Wow, that feels like another lifetime. It was so long ago, Izuku murmured, eyes wide as he leaned forward, the end of his hair nearly dipping into his own abandoned cup of tea, quickly growing cold. I know what you mean, Shoto murmured, surreptitiously snapping a picture of Izuku watching the slideshow with his phone camera. A wry smile on his face. Izuku didn't notice. It'd be the first one for the next slideshow. Shinso stood in front of Izuku, smirking as he held up Wink, wrapped in a blanket that looked like a tortilla. Izuku had his arms crossed around the middle, eyes sad but relieved at the sight of Wink before him. At the kitchen table behind them, Shoto had his head sitting on his palm as he gazed at Izuku, obvious concern on his face. Submitted by Ashido Mina. That was the night I had that nightmare, when I saw the cage for the first time. Izuku muttered, a quiet softness to his voice. Shoto shook his head in exasperation and directed a friendly glare at Shinso on the couch perpendicular to theirs. I wonder if things would have gone differently afterward if Shinso hadn't interrupted you when you were trying to tell me about it. Shinso snorted and then shrugged, looking away. Shoto sighed. Aizawa's 1A homeroom classroom showed up next. Izuku in the center of the picture, face planted on his desk. Wink was curled up on the back of his head, nestled in his curls. In front of his desk, Bakugo was pointedly looking away, while behind him, Shinso was replicating the gesture, also face first on his desk. Tall purple hair nearly touching Izuku's back. Submitted by Uraraka Ochako. You were such a jerk our first year. Izuku laughed, leaning back in his seat, looking toward Katsuki. I don't know what you're talking about. Katsuki glanced at Izuku before looking away. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. I was a jerk for a lot longer than our first year of high school. You got better, though, Izuku reassured. Tch. Katsuki growled, ignoring Kirishima bumping shoulders with him. Half of the class could be seen in this picture at a cat cafe. Tenya and Ochako were on a couch, Tenya talking with his hands while Ochako listened, with a smile on her face and adoration in her eyes even then. Present Mike sat on the floor, cats crawling all over him as he spoke to Kyoka, hand raised high in the air as if she was demonstrating the size of something. On Mike's other side, Izuku sat, shoulder to shoulder with Shoto as kittens played in their laps. Shoto was watching Izuku as the green-haired boy seemed to be looking around the room, a serious expression on his face, a bit of sadness and a little more confusion, as if he didn't quite understand what was going on. Submitted by Ashido Mina. I remember that day, Shoto murmured as Izuku leaned his head against his shoulder with a sigh. I didn't understand it yet, Izuku whispered under the shouting of his classmates. Neither of us did, Shoto answered. It took us a while to grasp what family was. Izuku nodded. The next one was also at the cat cafe and was zeroed in on Izuku and Shoto instead of everyone. It showed them both in a similar position as the one they were in now, Izuku's head against Shoto's shoulder, their sides pressed together. Izuku hadn't been able to tell at the time, but in the picture he could see light flickering along Shoto's cheek, as if his blush was so warm that it had almost caught his cheekbone on fire. Submitted by Ashido Mina. Izuku jabbed Shoto's side, snickering. Shoto shook his head, mussing his boyfriend's hair. It was all the same length again and down, wavy and dark green. This one was two pictures side by side. On the left was Izuku, arms wrapped around Aizawa as his guardian hugged him awkwardly, an exasperated look on his face as he looked at the person holding the camera, present Mike. Against Izuku's back, if he looked close enough, You could see Aizawa's hand subtly flipping the camera off. On the right side of the two pictures, also in the Yamada Aizawa dorm apartment, Izuku was now in Mike's arms. The blonde was grinning, ear to ear, arms tight around Izuku as he squeezed him happily. Submitted by Hisashi Yamada and Aizawa Shota. Izuku pursed his lips together before the corner of his mouth lifted in a small smile as he turned to Eri. "You're getting ready to come in, I think, Eri," he whispered. He remembered those two pictures being taken the morning that he met Eri, the morning he went on patrol at Night Eye's agency for the first time for his internship. How quickly things had changed. The 9-year-old gasped in excitement, pulling her legs beneath herself and watching the projection intently. Izuku laughed, patting his sister's back. And Izuku was right. Eri was in the next one. She stood next to Aizawa, hand on the sleeve over his elbow as he carried Izuku out of the common room, the boy completely asleep in his arms, hair falling down. Several members of the class could be seen sprawled across couches and on the floor in the dark room. Light from the TV showering over them all, showing that it'd been a movie night. Submitted by Ida Tenya. "That was after our failed attempt at hide-and-seek," Ida chuckled, arm around Ochako's back as she watched the picture. Izuku laughed. "I'd forgotten about that. We should try that again." Tenya grimaced. "I'd rather not have a repeat of you falling asleep on the ceiling with the entirety of the class in your mindscape." Izuku smiled widely and Shoto tilted his head, remembering that night fondly. Izuku had fallen asleep on him after the hide-and-seek mess, and Shoto had been so afraid to move that his legs had cramped so badly he'd needed help getting up after Aizawa had finally lifted Izuku and taken him back to their room. On the wall, the next picture played, the gentle tones of the music echoing around the room. Izuku and Shoto stood side by side in the light of the common room, both of them red in the face, and Shoto's eyes were wide in what looked like surprise. Submitted by Ashido Mina. Out of context, the picture didn't make any sense, but Izuku immediately knew what that picture was from. "That was after our first kiss in my mindscape," he whispered, leaning in closer to Shoto. "I remember," he responded, voice deep as he wrapped an arm around Izuku, pulling him close. "We've come far since then." Izuku nodded. "It's been a long 3 years." A gasp from Mike had Izuku glancing at his guardian, and then following his gaze back to the projection on the wall. Aizawa and Mike stood facing each other, Mike gesturing wildly with a huge grin on his face, while Aizawa stood, blank-faced but with eyes that showed contentedness, as he listened to whatever Mike was saying. Izuku was crouched at their feet, his hand out, a spoon popping into life over it, not yet touching his palm, as Eri stood in front of him, with a small parfait clutched in one hand, her other hand reaching for the spoon. They were all wearing suits except for Eri, who wore a cute blue dress, hair in braids. Everyone looked happy. Submitted by Shoto Todoroki. Izuku glanced at Shoto next to him, his heart fluttering strangely. "I don't remember. When did you take that? How have I never seen that picture?" Shoto smirked and shrugged as he leaned back. The slideshow continued, a catalogue of 3 years of Izuku's life. The class laughed and they cried and cheered. So many pictures were shown that it got late into the evening and Bakugo had to leave to start on their dinner. Usually Izuku would help him, but Bakugo told him to stay behind this time. The two had settled into a strange camaraderie over the years. They almost always made dinner together, leaving the cleaning to the rest of the class, grateful for Izuku and Bakugo's talent in the kitchen. Izuku relaxed against Shoto on the couch, Eri leaning against his side, petting Wink. The slideshow was still going on, but it had moved on to pictures of everyone, though Wink seemed to take up the majority of the pictures. He smiled as he watched his classmates have fun. This was going to end soon. They would graduate, and as much as they might want to stay near, they would all be heroes. They would go their separate ways and join their own agencies. Some would be heroes straight away. Some would be sidekicks. Either way, they would all be doing their own things as soon as they received that license. But for now, they were kids for just a little bit longer. And when it finally came time, when Izuku finally walked up the steps to receive his hero license, Toshi was the one to hand it to him. The biggest grin he'd ever seen spread on his mentor's face. Izuku took the license and diploma from Toshi and then threw his arms around him. He was still short, not nearly as short as he had once been, but in comparison to Toshi, Izuku was practically swallowed in his hug. Despite being told to hold their applause, every single person in Class 1A cheered for Izuku, even Katsuki giving a sharp whistle. When he returned to his seat, beating Shoto's eyes from where he sat with the T names, Izuku grinned and flashed his shiny new license. Shoto smiled back, and when he returned after his own name had been called, he lifted his own laminated license to show Izuku, both smiling at each other. When all was said and done, and all the diplomas and licenses and certificates and any number of other things were handed out, the class tossed their hats into the air, and Izuku and Shoto nearly ran to meet each other in the middle, as they rained down upon them, a sea of hats around them. They were heroes now. Truly and really heroes. Izuku stood on the edge, 1 foot halfway out over the far drop below. He overlooked the city with no fear, the sun high in the sky of the midsummer morning. The lights of the city below rose up to meet the shine of the sky above, and despite it all, Izuku could still see the stars, ever present. His arms were out to his sides, his chest falling and rising with each even and deep inhale and exhale. His hood was down, and his braid flared back in the wind, the hood itself lifting and shifting with the breeze. "Nova," a familiar voice said, and he turned around, brow raised as he took in the sight of his husband, dropping off a ramp of ice and onto the roof that Izuku stood on. Shoto pointed off to the side, and into the distance where Izuku had missed a cloud of dark smoke, growing larger even in the brief moment that Izuku watched. "City Hall is going down," Shoto explained rapidly, already lifting a hand to make another ramp. "Got a report of a fire and civilians stuck inside. Uravity, Ingenium, and Red Riot are en route. The cause of the fire is unknown, but the mission is to save them all," Izuku finished confidently. Shoto curved the corner of his mouth up in an indulgent smile as he created a line of ice outward toward the cloud of smoke. "Save them all," he agreed. Izuku cracked his knuckles as he took several steps backward before bending at the knees and lurching forward, taking 2 huge strides before flinging himself out and up, several quirks pulsing through his body, lightning flickering across his skin, eyes bright. He passed in front of the sun, lit up seemingly from within. Shoto kept up at his side, and they descended in sync with each other. Izuku landed as lightning arced off his body, the ground cracking and debris lifting. Float was more powerful than ever before. His hair, hood, and everything else small nearby lifting. Pieces of concrete and dirt, a force field around his body as he straightened, bolts flickering through his retinas. Flames blazed throughout the city hall in front of him as Shoto attacked it with his ice, running forward, an inferno. Izuku could feel the heat against his skin as he lifted his head, eyes narrowing as he called forth his own personal rain, lifting a hand and sending it all at the city hall. A barrage. Pressure in his veins and power coiling in his gut, Izuku leapt straight up from a standstill, landing on the collapsing roof of the building before dropping through with his weight. He landed carefully and expanded his senses, lifting his mask over his face, a part of his costume he'd added his 3rd year of high school. He could sense every single person stuck in the building, and he took a relaxing breath through his mask before darting forward, Shoto joining him at his side. His name was Nova, and he was the #1 hero in the country. He knew the world could be unkind and unfair, and that's why he was the type of hero that he was. The kind that wouldn't ignore those less fortunate than most, or the ones that were stuck in the dark. He stopped fires and held up buildings and captured villains. He rescued those lost in dark alleys, and the children living alone, and the victims of domestic violence. Nova was inspirational and strong, and he saved them all, no matter the glory or lack thereof in each fight. Villains feared him. Civilians felt safe because of him. Nova was everything All Might had been and more. Nova, the hero, saved them all. All right, listeners, this concludes the fic entitled State of Mind. This has been a wonderful, lengthy, in-depth project. I've loved reading this one, 28 chapters with over 212,000 words to it. It's always such a great feeling to get to the end of a podfic for a long fic. It's this wonderful feeling of accomplishment. I love getting to the last chapter to hear the reactions at the end, especially. I love seeing your reactions and your thoughts throughout, but it means so much to see what you think once that fic completes. So I'd love to hear from you, dropping those comments below for me. My own thoughts for myself, I love the mental health themes that take place throughout this fanfic. I think the author does a fantastic job with those, and the importance of healing from past traumas, how those types of experiences that Izuku had in this fic had carried with him for a long time, and it's not always an easy or straightforward path to healing. So the author did fantastic with this. Of course, I'm also a sucker for a tododeku fic, and I think there was a great tie of shared experiences and shared traumatic pasts that they were both trying to heal from and supporting each other with. So let me know your thoughts. Drop those comments below for me. Just as a reminder, this fic is located over on AO3, so you can always slide over leaving comments, kudos, and support to the original author as well. I'm sure it's much appreciated. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.